mystery. The telephone circuits are humming with calls radiating out from FBI headquarters in Chicago to agents in the West. As our scene opens, we hear...
Denver FBI. Knox speaking.
Hello, Knox. This is Sam Judson in Chicago reporting a jewel theft.
I'm listening.
Mr. Digby, president of Giles Department Store here, reported it a short while ago. They're selling the Babson collection of jewels.
Some nice rocks in that batch, I'll bet.
Yes, and one of them is missing. A fabulous diamond bracelet.
Where do we go from there?
It seems that the bracelet was first missed about 3:30. Several customers had been interested during the afternoon. One man in particular stands out in the clerk's mind.
Well, what's his description?
About 50, gray hair, bushy eyebrows, and penetrating brown eyes. Very distinguished.
Anything unusual?
Yes, a slight French accent.
Well, where does the Denver Bureau fit into the puzzle?
Maybe it doesn't, but the chief wants all the westbound trains checked to see if we can locate the Frenchman. Assuming that the thief was in Giles' store in Chicago around 3:30 and left for the west on the first train, he would have caught the 5:30. When she goes through Denver, get aboard and see what you can see.
Well, how do you figure he left Chicago on a train and is heading for the coast?
It is pretty flimsy evidence, but oddly enough, he took the clerk's name. Said on his return from the west coast he would stop in again.
Can you beat that for boldness? Well, you may be right after all about his being on one of the western-bound trains.
That's for you to find out, my boy. Good luck.
Thanks, Judson. See you soon, I hope. I beg your pardon, but haven't I seen you somewhere before?
I believe it not, monsieur.
Funny, though. I thought I might have seen you in Chicago.
I have never been there myself. I passed through only on this train yesterday for the first time. I wish we had time to get off and look around.
Oh, you're traveling with someone else, huh?
Oh, yes, my wife, Madame Bedeau, and I left New York together several days ago.
Where you bound?
For the West Coast.
Well, I hope your business isn't too pressing, because I'm going to have to ask you to get off at the next stop with me.
Oh, but monsieur, this is some sort of a joke. 1 minute you wish to be my friend, the next minute my enemy.
On the contrary, Mr. Badeau, I'm an agent of the FBI, and your description fits perfectly the case I'm working on. The mistake in your alibi also fits. Wouldn't I be foolish to let you slip through my fingers?
But I know nothing of this case, monsieur.
I have a wire in my pocket dated March 10th, 1945, confirming my instructions from our Chicago office. The story fits perfectly. This is it, Mr. Badeau, where you get off.
How did Knox decide that Badeau was his man? In a minute, Knox will tell us how, but first... And now, back to the solution of our story.
Being a foreigner who apparently had not done much traveling in this country, Mr. Badeau did not realize that there is no train service through from east to the west coast. There is always a break in Chicago where one has to change to another train. So when Mr. Badeau declared he had not been off the train and had come through from New York, I was pretty convinced that he was my man. And as it turned out, I was right.
Another 5-minute mystery. The usual peace and quiet of a small college town was disturbed one day last summer when Inspector Brass received a phone call from Dr. Jonathan Brown, professor of chemistry at the university.
Inspector, you've got to come right away. Something terrible. My wife has been poisoned.
I'll be right up. Don't disturb anything.
I'll do as you say, Inspector. You'll be right up.
Very soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Doc, I'm on a rush autopsy. Grab your stuff and hurry up to Dr. Brown's place at 1412 Church Avenue. Says his wife is dead. Poisoned. How did you know, Dr. Brown, that your wife died from poison?
Being a chemist, I am well acquainted with poisons and their effects. As soon as I saw my wife, I knew that her physical appearance could only have been the result of poison.
Do you keep any drugs or poisons around the house?
Yes, I do. I sometimes work in my laboratory in the cellar.
Mm-hmm. Members of the household could get to the stuff rather easily then.
Yes, I'm afraid so. I haven't been too careful with just the nurse, the cook, and myself around.
I understand that your wife has been ill for quite some time.
Yes, 10 years. She was an invalid for the past 2 years. We've had Miss Calthorne as her constant companion and nurse all these years.
Are you Miss Calthorne?
Yes, I am.
She's been very wonderful to my wife. Took care of her better than a mother cares for a child. Did everything. Washed her, dressed her, tasted her food to make sure it wasn't too hot or cold or badly seasoned. Read to her. I've been very grateful.
Is that right, Miss Calthorne?
Yes, sir. Mrs. Brown trusted me completely. She was my friend. It was a horrible accident.
What'd you find, Doc?
poison, just like her husband said. Acted within a quarter of an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
No, not right now.
Well, see you in the morgue. So long.
So long. Miss Calthorne, were you with Mrs. Brown all the time?
Yes, sir. While I was feeding her, she was seized by a spasm and gagged and became discolored. I've been nursing for 20 years, and I've seen the symptoms of poison before. I gave her something to counteract the poison, but the poison acted too quickly.
When did Dr. Brown finally get there?
By the time I arrived, my wife was dead. I don't blame Miss Calthorne. She did the best she could. I think it was a terrible accident.
Well, Dr. Brown, I disagree. It wasn't an accident. Miss Calthorne, would you be so kind as to accompany me to headquarters? You're under arrest for murder.
What made the inspector so sure that it was murder? In a moment we'll know, but first... Now, back to our story.
Rather unusual, Miss Calthorne. You didn't care who was suspected, including yourself. But you made one slip. You agreed with the doctor when he said that you did everything for Mrs. Brown, including tasting her food. If the food was accidentally poisoned, you would have died too. Therefore, Mrs. Brown must have been poisoned during or after her meal. You talked her into believing she was poisoned by the food. So she would do anything to save herself. That is, take your so-called remedy. Only it wasn't a remedy. It was poison.
Another 5-minute mystery. Midnight. A penthouse on one of Manhattan's skyscrapers, owned by wealthy Roger Hammond. In the dim light of his library, Hammond studies a group of papers on his desk. Then comes a knock on the door.
Come in. Who is it? I can't see you in this blasted darkness, so come in. What do you want? You've got a gun. In heaven's name, don't point that thing at me. Stop it, do you hear? Stop it!
Come in, Mrs. Hammond.
Thank you, Inspector Mills. I flew back from Uruguay as soon as I got your telegram.
Will you sit down?
Roger's death is the most shocking thing that's ever happened to me. Who could have done this all for murder?
I wish I knew, Mrs. Hammond. Of course, we'll do everything we can. Now, there are a few questions I'd like to ask. Merely routine, of course.
Anything I can tell you, Inspector.
This friend of your husband, Stanley Macon, was there any friction between them?
Oh, no, never. They were the best of friends.
Macon was alone at his hunting lodge in Maine when the murder occurred.
And I was so far away. If only I'd been here.
Exactly why did you go to Uruguay, Mrs. Hammond?
Business for Roger. And because I'd never been to South America, he thought it'd be a kind of vacation for me.
Mm-hmm.
Been there only 2 days when I received your wire telling me what happened.
Yes. Do you mind telling me what your plans are? Will you take over Mr. Hammond's enterprises?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose so. I haven't been able to think of anything these last few days. It's so hard to believe he's gone. Then I suppose I was warned of it in a way.
What do you mean?
Well, it's one of those things that's hard to explain. A terrible presentiment I had. One evening in Uruguay, the night of his murder.
Tell me about it.
It's really nothing, Inspector.
In murder, everything is important, Mrs. Hammond.
I'd gone for an automobile ride, all alone. The moon was shining very brightly, and I was speeding, I'm afraid. But I'm a careful driver. I always keep far to the right. And that night, I made a point of it because I was speeding. Well, suddenly, in the center of the right lane, I saw the figure of a man. I slammed on the brakes, and I was terrified to see in the headlights that the man was Roger. I swerved and ran the car off the road and stopped.
You must have been terribly frightened.
Oh, I was. But I climbed out and ran back to the highway, and on the whole stretch of road, there wasn't anybody at all. And I could see clearly in the moonlight. I know you won't believe me.
You're right, I don't. Because you're lying, Mrs. Hammond.
Lying? Why, what do you mean?
I mean you were never in Uruguay at all. And I'm going to hold you for questioning and perhaps for murder. What was the clue that made Inspector Mills know Tony Hammond was not telling the truth? In a moment we'll hear, but first... And now, the solution to our mystery. Mrs. Hammond stayed behind in New York, killed her husband, and supposedly returned from South America to tell me about her strange presentiment. She said she was driving on the right side of the road. So I knew she couldn't have been to Uruguay, or she'd have known that Uruguay is the only country in the Western Hemisphere where driving on the left still prevails.